My pleasure to introduce Carol Blessing, who's Professor of Literature and Women's Studies at Point Loma, Nazarene University. Her particular interests are British literature and history, and she'll be speaking to us today on disappearing women, the gendered politics of publication of Mary Fletcher's autobiography.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think that I'm probably the only person here who's a literature professor rather than a theologian, church historian, Bible scholar. Yeah, but I've long been interested in women's studies, from what Gareth said, and that includes, of course, the writings of women. And because of my own heritage in the United Methodist Church and now the Nazarene Church, I wanted to know more about women throughout history. And I have to say, back when I first started as a professor at Point Loma, Nazarene in 1993, I knew of the heritage of Phineas Bresee and his having women help him within establishing the church. But I have to admit that I didn't see a whole lot of female preachers, and which is thankfully improving through the years. And so as part of my impetus for doing this kind of research, I wanted to go back and see and actually hear from the voices of earlier women. So Disappearing Women, the Gendered Politics of Publication of Mary Fletcher's Autobiography. And originally I had a PowerPoint presentation for this, and I hadn't realized until yesterday that we wouldn't have a PowerPoint available. So I originally was going to show the transcribed letters and journals and so on the PowerPoint to kind of speed up the process rather than reading them. So instead I'll have to read excerpts of them here. So, Mary Boson K. Fletcher, the wealthy, independent, and outspoken British woman who worked tirelessly within Methodist circles before, during, and after her 3-year marriage in 1782 to 1785 to the Reverend John Fletcher, John Wesley's successor. This is about her story and also about her helper, Mary Tooth. Although John Fletcher's early death thwarted Wesley's plan, Mary Fletcher continued to coordinate the Methodist movement in Madeley, Shropshire. Till her own death in 1815, she led class meetings, counseled parishioners, held love feasts, scheduled circuit preachers, and essentially functioned as a preacher herself. Throughout her life, she kept extensive journals, copies of her correspondence, and transcriptions of her Sunday night sermons, which she called watchwords, as well as wrote her own autobiography. And she had her assistant and unofficially adopted daughter, Mary Tooth, serve as archivists of her papers, showing her intention to produce a formal autobiographical work in publication. Toward the end of her life, one of Mary Fletcher's letters expresses concerns that her writing may be misinterpreted or reflect negatively upon the Methodist movement. She said, "I have had some trials with regard to our affairs, but I have a full confidence all shall end well. We have had for 30 years a oneness of people, but now there's a separation from the desire of the minister. It hurts me. Yet I believe the Lord will make all well. I here declare I have been joined to the people united to Mr. Wesley for above 80 years, and I trust to die among them, as yet the life of true religion is among them, and the work increases. If my papers fall into any hands, entreat here Jesus may never be defeated." It was crucial that she control how and by whom her papers, that is the draft of her autobiography, would be printed to represent her late spouse, the Reverend John Fletcher, the Methodist movement in Madeley, and herself. In one of Mary Tooth's letters, she reveals that Mary Fletcher had, in fact, wanted her initially to edit and publish her life. Tooth felt inadequate for the task, and Mary Fletcher tried to persuade her by reminding her that God would enable her. But Tooth did not give her word that she would do other than take charge of her papers and use the utmost care in determining who was worthy of them. Taking her charge as keeper of Mary Fletcher's manuscripts very seriously, Mary Tooth turned down several potential editors for the life, as recorded through draft replies to men who wished to obtain the papers. Tooth would not allow anyone access who did not meet 3 requirements. 1, the person needed to come to Madeley to view the work there firsthand. 2, the person needed to promise not to edit out substantial parts of Mary Fletcher's life and beliefs. And 3, Mary Tooth needed to be involved in or even control the process. Of note, Tooth dismisses in strong language George Mortimer's attempt to control the papers with a letter that alludes to a conflict regarding some of Mary Fletcher's idea. According to Gareth Lloyd's notes to the Fletcher Tooth collection, former curate of Madeley from 1815 to 1825, George Mortimer's relationship with the Methodists there became strained after Mary Fletcher's death. Tooth ultimately sought out the Reverend Henry Moore as editor, a decision most apparently aligned with her mentor's wishes. Writing to Mary Tooth in 1818, Mary Whittingham, Mary Fletcher's niece, noted that Mary Fletcher favored the decision. I much approve of its being done by Mr. Moore, as he was the person my dear aunt approved. You appear to me to have done your duty to her memory, and your attention to the publishing of her life is greatly to my satisfaction. Henry Moore's September 26, 1816 letter to Tooth states, I have received the life and journals of your excellent friend. I cannot express the admiration of it as I could wish, especially in this short letter. It describes the simple life divine, which men are so aware to receive, and in comparison of which even what is prized among many religions is wood, hay, and stubble. Moore opens his 1817 completed work, The Life of Mrs. Mary Fletcher, consort and relict of the Reverend John Fletcher, with the following account regarding how he had come to edit her manuscripts into a published life story. He writes, a short time after I was appointed to the Birmingham district, the papers of the late Mrs. Fletcher were put into my hands. I was informed at the time that the venerable person whose life was recorded in them had mentioned me as one that she wished could prepare and publish her papers, and that an application to that effect would have been made to me before that time, but that the distance of my former appointment had prevented it. Mrs. Fletcher having laid an injunction on her friend, to whom by will she had committed them, that is, she willed her papers to Mary Tooth, not to give them absolutely into the hands of any person whatsoever. But he never mentions Mary Tooth's name. The friend to whom Henry Moore refers is, of course, Mary Tooth, the anonymous woman who has made possible not only Moore's Life of Mary Fletcher in 1817 with the subsequent editions, but also the Fletcher Tooth collection in the World Methodist Archives at the John Rylands Library, and indeed much of our knowledge about the Methodist movement in Madeley, Shropshire. Moore does not mention Tooth in his preface as the source of the biography, nor does he relate the work Tooth did in carefully writing, copying, and filing letters, journals, and other accounts, providing the primary documentation of the lives of Mary Fletcher, Sarah Ryan, Mary Tooth herself, as well as material on the Reverend John Fletcher, and making suggestions and corrections to the biography. All the editions of the life credit Moore solely with the work, though in actuality it was a joint effort with Mary Tooth. Though Moore does include Tooth's narrative of Mary Fletcher's death as an epilogue, he otherwise effaces her from printed history. In fact, he has excised portions of Mary Fletcher's journals that discuss how valuable Tooth's help has been to her, omitting these excerpts found in Mary Fletcher's manuscript journals. You can see where he's gone through and crossed out in pencil some references that say, I find Miss Tooth a very great help and a faithful, diligent assistant. And then these are in 1802. Also that with the passing of Sarah Ryan, the Lord never failed to give me Mary Tooth to me as an assistant, and her a capacity to take off several burdens. Mary Tooth's letter to Henry Moore further show her as working actively with him to try to shape the account of her beloved Mary Fletcher in a positive manner, and most importantly, have her presented as a female preacher. Again, Mary Fletcher willed her papers to Tooth to see if she could get them published. In 1805, Mary Fletcher was already contemplating her death 10 years ahead of her passing, and she was worried about the care of her papers. And she says, therefore, for the benefit of the Methodist Conference, I desire my papers, that is, according to a paper of contents included, I desire to have some opinion better than my own, whether they are thought proper to be presented or not. A thought strikes my mind, perhaps, that the best mode of printing might be in numbers. Suppose the life in 4 parts is now divided. And she goes on and lays out the way that she thinks the life should be organized there. I located another file of Henry Moore's letters filed outside of the Fletcher Tooth archive, though they contain 10 letters and dialogue with Tooth about the publishing process of Mary Fletcher's life. Moore expresses great enthusiasm initially about the papers and the project. He opines that the manuscripts can almost be published verbatim without alteration or deletions, and reiterates in several letters his desire to consult Tooth on all issues of importance. Moore also presses the Methodist book coordinator to allow him to have the work published locally and in 2 volumes, as well as to produce a lower cost 1-volume edition to be given to a poorer audience, according to Mary Tooth's wishes. However, there is one major issue on which he and Tooth parted ways. Tooth is particularly concerned with presenting Mary Bosanquet Fletcher as a legitimate, groundbreaking female speaker/preacher, as documented in a continuing exchange with Henry Moore and his wife Mary Ann. Tooth writes to the Reverend Moore and is frequently answered by his wife, possibly showing another layer of gendered politics. On December 22nd, 1817, Tooth writes, "My brother, I am sorry to trouble you with a letter from me, but receiving a letter on Saturday inquiring, among other things, why Mrs. Fletcher's letter to Mr. Wesley on women's speaking with his answer was not inserted in her life. I thought I had better send it to you, though it may be too late, as possibly you have concluded the work by this time." There are some follow-up letters from Tooth on the same topic, who felt that it was crucial that this specific letter to Wesley, in its fullness, be a part of Mary Fletcher's biography. And that was, the letter in question was that part of that now famous correspondence with Wesley, who had replied back to her, "My dear sister, I think the strength of the cause rests here on your having an extraordinary call," depending on her preaching. And then generally, he said, St. Paul's ordinary rule was, I permit not a woman to speak in the congregation. Yet in extraordinary cases, he made a few exceptions, at Corinth in particular. While Wesley's letter at first seems positive, it does raise the issue of the double standard to which Wesley held. A woman's preaching is anomalous, not a practice Wesley wanted to create or reinforce. Nonetheless, it's clear Wesley felt Mary Bosanquet a gifted woman. Later, however, Wesley would write a letter to George Robinson to censor female leadership, saying, "I desire Mr. Peacock to put a final stop to the preaching of women in his circuit. If it were suffered, it should grow, and we would not know where it would end." Even so, despite Wesley's reservations, women's preaching thankfully did grow. The letter Tooth wants to include in the biography is Mary Fletcher's 1771 detailed apologia for women's preaching. In his 1993 volume, She Offered Him Christ, The Legacy of Women Preachers in Early Methodism, which includes a transcribed version of the letter, Paul Chilcote notes that the print version first appeared in Zechariah Taft's 1820, The Scripture Doctrine of Women's Preaching, Stated and Examined. However, Taft's was actually a much abridged version. Taft states in his volume that this is part of Mrs. B's letter and part of his John Wesley's answer regarding an extraordinary call. He prints the exchange to show Wesley's somewhat grudging acceptance of Mary Bosanquet's speaking. The version Mary Tooth presents from her archives of Mary Fletcher's letter is considerably longer, more developed in its arguments, and more inclusive of important contexts, condemning the notion that all men are free to pursue ministry no matter how little qualified, while women are limited to an exceptional call, which is even then viewed with apprehension and limited in scope. 46 years after it was written, Mary Tooth recognizes that this was a key work in showing Mary Fletcher's motivations for her ministry, as well as a justification for other female preachers to follow. When I was last at the Rylands in 2015 is the last time I was there, I found several slightly different versions in the Fletcher Tooth archive, copied out by Mary Tooth. And some were different slightly than what Chilcote had printed in his work as well. Chilcote surmises that Henry More did not know of the complete letter, but More's manuscript correspondence shows otherwise, as this paper will record Tooth's unhappily unsuccessful persistence in trying to have More publish the entirety. The correspondence aptly exemplifies the gendered politics of representing both Mary Fletcher and Mary Tooth. Basically, a letter transcribed into 3 single-space typed pages has about 2/3 of its content excised by its editor, Henry More. And I can't really show you. I don't know if you can see, like, some of it's highlighted, but it's not in color. So it's like, for every page, only a little bit is printed by More. And so an enormous amount is omitted. More removes most of Mary Bosanquet's experiential documentation of her preaching work, beginning with weekly prayer meetings that she led with helper Sarah Ryan, which grew into meetings held 3 or 4 times weekly in Yorkshire, reaching, as she estimates, hundreds of people. Though supported by Mr. Oliver, other male preachers castigated her work as unscriptural female preaching. Nonetheless, Mary Bosanquet Fletcher continued to meet in private houses as well as more public spaces, explaining that the zeal of the people, they have given out the meeting in a preaching house because they had no private house that would hold the people, nor 1/2 quarter of them. When we came and I saw hundreds of carnal were there, my heart yearned over them, and I feared my master should say, "Their blood I require of you." Henry More also excised the bulk of Bosanquet Fletcher's reasoning and scriptural interpretation to justify women preachers. She answers the argument that some improper women might try to speak with a deft reply. This I acknowledge I have feared, but the same might be said of every preacher that comes out. Will not some improper man follow him? Fletcher continues with the dialogical form, circling back to her divine calling as ultimate justification. Objection, but if an improper man comes out, the church has proven to stop his mouth, but you won't let your mouth be stopped. Answer, yes, on the same condition I will. You would not say to him, no man must speak, therefore be silent. But only you are not the proper man. Now allowing women may speak, prove it to me, it is not my personal call, and I will both lovingly and cheerfully obey. Not only does More omit much of Mary Fletcher's apologia for women's preaching, but he provides his own somewhat sheepish explanation for Fletcher's activities through his conclusive commentary entitled A Review of Her Character. Seeking to control the perception of his subject by rendering her more acceptable to wider audiences, More actually undermines Fletcher's work. The gendered power struggle is obvious. Tooth's determination to present Mary Fletcher as the strong, outspoken woman who had mentored her and provided a model of a woman in ministry is overcome by More's unchallenged position of a male ministerial authority and access to publishing. By rewriting the epistolary exchange between the then Mary Bosanquet and John Wesley, More literally edits out a portion of her life. As he opines when introducing her activities, I am sensible that here I tread on tender ground. The question of the lawfulness or even of the expediency of female preaching will recur to every sensible and pious reader, especially as Mary Fletcher lived and died a member of the Church of England and of the Methodist Society, neither of which sanctions a female ministry. But I cannot think that much has been said on this question, especially since the days of George Fox, when ministry of females received a regular establishment in his community. Mr. Wesley, who never sanctioned a regular ministry of that kind, permitted and, it may be said, encouraged her Christian efforts in that way. And then it kind of goes on about the letter there. Although hesitant to admit what the labors of love entailed that he references in regard to Mary Bosanquet, Henry Moore knew that both Mary Fletcher and Mary Tooth had stretched John Wesley's ideas regarding women in ministry, acknowledging the criticisms that Fletcher faced. Mary Fletcher had established a meeting house outside the parish church, an alternate sacred space within the local tithe barn, painted white inside and out where she would preach. Mary Tooth, in turn, created what she called the upper room in her house, where meetings and love feasts were held. Mary Fletcher's mysticism was also a controversial issue. She recorded numerous dreams and visions, many of her dead husband speaking to her in her journals, a subject dealt with at length by historian Phyllis Mack in Heart, Religion, and the British Enlightenment, Gender and Emotion in Early Methodism. Going through the Henry Moore's marked up manuscripts of Mary Fletcher's life, one can ascertain that Moore has also edited out numerous versions of Fletcher's more mystical sections, including some of her dreams and waking visions, though he does include a section entitled Her Thoughts on Communion with Happy Spirits. A note in Moore's hand and signed editor on the reverse side of Mary Fletcher's journal account of helping heal a young girl by recommending a common medicine reveals the way in which Mary Fletcher's work was regarded as a special outpouring of the Spirit rather than as a precedent for continued practice. And he said, as it was in the days of the personal ministry of the Son of God, so it is in his Spirit's gospel day. He hides those things from the wise and prudent, and revealeth them unto babes, the weary and heavy laden who believe. In producing his version of Mary Fletcher's life, Moore exercises prudent caution to get the volume published and record Wesleyan Methodist practice for posterity. He is no doubt wary of ostracizing Methodist officials and reducing the audience for what in some ways became his book, as he included the extent of Mary Fletcher's work and her lengthy justification for women's preaching. In 1803, the Methodist Conference had censured women's preaching, though obviously Mary Fletcher, Tooth, and Taft, and other females within the Methodist movement clearly violated the injunction, and then this is of women preaching. Should women be permitted to preach among us? Answer, we are of the opinion that in general they are not, because a vast majority of our people are opposed to it, because their preaching does not at all seem necessary, there being a sufficiency of preachers whom God has accredited, and so on. There. And then once again, there's a grudging acceptance for special cases, but preferably just to other women and not to men. Other letters exchanged between Tooth and the Moores showed Tooth's concern for the progress of the printing, the distribution of the books, and other content issues of Mary Fletcher's biography. And one of those included also the omission of Sarah Lawrence's life and details there. And then I have a section. Mary Tooth herself continues on with documented preaching, including at Dudley Chapel in London in 1824. Towards her later years, Mary Tooth's time in Madeley was not as well accepted, as her ministry was perceived as conflicting with the official Methodist chapel constructed in the area. Portions of other letters show criticisms of her meetings in the tithe barn, as the Methodist movement sought to stabilize itself into more conventional denomination. But that is for another paper. Prized by Mary Fletcher for her usefulness, Mary Tooth is primarily remembered by posterity as Mary Fletcher's secretary, a role that is often devalued because it is primarily gendered female. Epistolary writings were considered an appropriate women's genre. Without them, however, the Methodist movement of Shropshire and beyond would have been weakened and short-lived. Both of the Mary's ministries included letters not only of information but also comfort, exhortation, and teaching. Tooth's worth extends far beyond a banal position, for without her we would have little knowledge of the Methodist movement within Madeley in the late 18th and earlier 19th century. She served as the sole archivist for the Methodist movement as well as of the Fletcher Library, which carries her name in most volumes. In addition to her scribal strengths, Mary Tooth also followed in the footsteps of her spiritual mother in coordinating circuit preachers, leading class meetings, collecting dues, and even preaching. This was still ongoing until at least 1832, when Henrietta Roberts inquired of Tooth, "We have heard that you have lost the barn as a preaching house. I long to hear that you go on. Have you a chapel, or are you preaching in your upper room?" The depth and importance of Mary Tooth's role are little acknowledged in Henry Moore's volume. Tooth proved a strong advocate for Mary Fletcher's preaching role as well, though she was unsuccessful at persuading Moore to publish in its entirety the strongest apologia for women's preaching since Quaker co-founder Margaret Fell Fox's Women's Speaking Justified, Proved, and Allowed of the Scripture in 1666. Thanks to her manuscripts, however, Mary Tooth has preserved the unexpurgated version of this work for us today. The example highlights the necessity of archival research, especially in earlier eras when the politics of publication required editing a female's work for the sake of conventionality.
Has anybody any questions to ask?
Should I stay in?
If I could start off, have you got any idea as to why Henry Moore was chosen to be the biographer?
So I don't know. Excuse me. So Mary Fletcher had apparently decided on it.
Okay.
Excuse me. Now, yeah. So at first she wanted Mary Tooth, and then apparently she had put forward Henry Moore's names, so because of her connection, I guess, with him and his wife. So. Excuse me, sir.
Anybody else?
Along with that, is that all we know that she chose him? Is there any correspondence or instructions that she gave, or
Well,
what was she expecting from him?
excuse me. Some of it also was in the overhead, but or in the PowerPoint. But there were, I think I had read a few references there. Well, in the 1805 draft was actually to an unknown recipient, and it was talking to the person who would be receiving it. And I guess I'm assuming that was Henry Moore, because later Mary Tooth said that Henry Moore was the one she had chosen.
I think Stanley has a question.
Yeah, thank you for your paper and just work in the primary documents. I was wondering, did you say, and I just might have missed this, did you say that like her kind of full defense, is that available? I mean, is that...
So I thought that it wasn't available, and I transcribed, and she had several versions, but then I found, because I thought that Paul Chilcote had just referenced Taft's version, but he actually had a version of it in his 1993 volume. So it's not.
And there's newer.
Yes.
Newer book.
It's also
Anthology.
he reproduces it in there too, but it's missing some things like preachers' specific names, which I'm not sure of why that was edited out. That was available in the original manuscripts.
So did you say also that there was several versions of that?
Slightly different versions,
Is
right?
his what you consider the most comprehensive version, or is there?
Well,
or is it really hard to tell what is most?
his is a modernized version,
Oh, okay.
so it is somewhat different there, but yes.
So I think David had a question
It's
also.
a question actually. Thank you for that. I may have had a bit of a brainstorm, but was Henry Moore also one of the competing post-mortem biographers of John Wesley?
Yes.
And I wonder whether
So that's mentioned in one of his.
was anything to do with her choice.
That was mentioned in one of his letters as well,
I
right?
just wondered if that might have influenced the choice in some way, because he'd already established something of a track record in across the connection
So,
through what
yeah,
was
no,
actually
yeah.
quite a blood process of competing biographers.
Mhm.
I might be
About the
wrong.
ownership of the partly about the ownership of the inaction, and I wonder whether there's something similar going on here, about a very careful choice in order to get the right story out.
Right.
I may be wrong about this, but I seem to recall that the autobiography was not published by the Wesleyan Church, it was published by another company.
Yeah, I should have brought my.
Which suggests that it wasn't entirely true.
I think that
officially.
again, in my PowerPoint, have a picture of the frontis piece there, so it's possible. I haven't.
We've got time for one more question. Any takers?
So the the 1803 statement encompasses really harsh.
Right.
And I'm wondering if later, because the work that Moore put together came out.
1817 was the first edition.
Okay. So, with all of his editing, do you feel like that, he was concerned about his audience was part of that? I mean, the question came to my mind, if he had just published it as is, would it have had an audience?
Right, that's
kind of the...
right, so it's not necessarily that he had nefarious intentions in omitting things. I think that he was being prudent to try to appeal to the widest audience.
But it's still a
for sure.
loss.
So,
If I could say as well that I've looked at the autobiography in detail, and some of the stuff in there would not have been published in the 19th century. For example, she describes at the age of 6, I think, cutting her own arm in order to bring on spiritual visions. So that would not have been. That would have been completely
right,
out.
all those mystical.
And in another passage, she describes breastfeeding the people of Madeley. So this was deeply charismatic.
So he may have in a sense, run interference that by his editing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But all her papers are there somewhere.
Right.
Yes, the John Wesley.
They've all been
Thanks to
there.
Gareth.
42 boxes of papers. It's absolutely
Right.
beast
How
of
many?
a collection.
Yeah.
42 boxes.
Which I've been through all of
Wow.
them,
Yeah.
and then plus additionally that another separate file of Henry Moore's letters.
Okay. Thank you very
Thanks.
much, Carol. Thank you.